So if you've decided to watch this video, then you probably have questions about levels and curves adjustments in Photoshop, such as what are they, how do you use them, how are they the same and how are they different, and is one better than the other? Well, it turns out you've come to the right place. Hi folks, I'm Sean Bagshaw, and besides here on my YouTube channel, you can find me at these other questionable internet establishments. Now, as I've said many times before, Photoshop is perhaps the most powerful and flexible tool for developing photographs, but it's also complex and not always intuitive. My video course called Photoshop Essentials for Outdoor Photographers is designed to help nature photographers become proficient with Photoshop once and for all. However, there's always more to know and learn about the program, so while this short tutorial stands fine on its own, it's also a great add-on to the Photoshop Essentials course. So if you'd like to download this video so you can have it on your computer, I'll have a download link down in the thing. So even though Photoshop has been around for decades now, many of us are just getting into it for the first time, and even for those who have been using it for many years, some things can still be a little mysterious. Now, two questions that repeatedly come up about Photoshop are, one, what is the difference between levels adjustment and the curves adjustment? And two, is one of them better than the other one? Now, I'm certainly not the first person to tackle these questions. There's many videos about this topic on YouTube, and in fact, my friend Josh Cripps went there about 5 years ago in this video that you should also watch. So let's start with looking at what levels and curves are used for. Actually, in Photoshop, there are several adjustments that are good for adjusting brightness and contrast. Levels and curves are among those, but also there's exposure and brightness contrast. We're not going to talk about exposure, but we will briefly talk about brightness contrast because it's actually the most simple way to adjust brightness and contrast. In the brightness contrast adjustment, you just have two sliders. One to adjust the brightness, make it lighter or darker, and one to adjust the contrast, less contrast or more contrast. Now this is great because it's so simple, and if it gets the look you're going for, then there's no reason not to use it. But you have very little control with just the two sliders. It's applying a set amount of both brightness and contrast based on the slider position, and you really can't control where or how that brightness and contrast is applied. So you can see that even if I bring the contrast all the way up, there's a limited amount of contrast that I can add to this image. So, that's maxed it out. So let's turn off that adjustment, and now let's try levels for comparison. Now in levels, we'll take a quick look at the controls. First of all, you have a histogram here that shows the histogram of the image, or where the various tonal values in the image are located. And if you compare it to the histogram of the image, you'll notice they're the same. And this is some information that you don't get with brightness contrast. Now, if you know about histograms, you'll know that the graph shows the dark values or the shadow values on the left, shows the highlights or the bright values on the right, and midtones are in the middle. And we can see from this image, this is a low contrast image because we have lots and lots of midtones and no real bright highlights and no real dark shadows. The adjustments that you can make with levels are with a black slider, a white slider, and a midpoint slider. And the black slider we can bring over to determine where our darkest blacks are. And the white slider you can slide over to determine where the brightest whites are. And just the act of doing that adjustment, we've increased contrast. The definition of contrast is the relationship between the darkest darks and the lightest lights. So if you make the darks darker and the lights lighter, you are increasing contrast. And here's what that adjustment looks like so far. At this point, I've brought the black point over to the edge of where the tonal values are in this image, and the white point over to the light edge of where those tonal values are. If I hold down the Alt or the Option key while dragging either of these sliders, I can get what's called a highlight warning. So this shows me if I'm clipping out highlights. So I don't want to clip any of my highlights. It's somewhere right in there, but I actually liked having it kind of over there with some of these brighter specular highlights. And the same thing, if I hold down Alt or Option and drag the black slider, we can see where we start clipping the shadows or the blacks, somewhere in there. The midpoint slider determines where the midpoint is between the darks and the lights. So for example, with it just in the middle, we've kind of got it evenly spaced between the dark values and the light values. But if I want more of the image to be on the light side, then I would drag the midpoint to the left so that more of those tonal values are above the midpoint. And if I want it to be on the darker side, then I drag it to the right so that more of the tonal values are below the midpoint. Being able to control where that midpoint slider is gives you more control over the contrast and the brightness in the adjustment than the brightness contrast adjustment layer itself does, because I can bring this over quite a ways and adjust that midpoint towards the darks. And if I wanted to, I can also bring the highlight slider, up past the brightest highlights if I want to do some highlight clipping in some areas. And I can even bring the black slider in maybe past the darkest darks if I don't mind having some clipped shadows some places. And in that way, I can adjust and fine tune that contrast much differently and much more effectively than I might be able to with just the brightness contrast adjustment, even though I've got the contrast in this one all the way maxed out. That adjustment, Photoshop automatically sets it to try to not allow you to clip highlights and shadows or move that midpoint around. So if this was the look I was going for, then I could do it with this adjustment. But if I was going for something a little more aggressive like that, then the levels adjustment can get me there. In the levels adjustment, we also have something called output sliders or output levels down here. And these output sliders, what they do is determine what the maximum dark and light values are. So when the maximum black output is at 0, you can go all the way to complete black. So somewhere in here, if I hold down the Alt key and click, we can see I've got some pure black up there in that little spot. And same thing with the white, I can see where my pure whites are. Everywhere you see those little dots. And my white output can go all the way to 255, which is the pure white value. But if I bring this slider over, and let's say I set the output to 10. Now what that's saying is don't allow the value of the blacks to get any blacker than 10. So 0 would be pure black. So I'm not getting all the way to pure black now. I'm just getting down to almost black. And if I brought that output level way over, you could say, okay, don't even let my blacks get to kind of a gray color, and that gives you a very washed out effect. And same thing with the whites. It says don't let my pure white value go all the way to white. If I only want my whites to get up to 180, then that maintains or constrains the whites to not becoming pure white. Now those output controls are okay if you're trying to avoid getting pure blacks or pure whites in your image for some reason, but it's not helping retain any shadow or highlight detail. So let me show you this. So if I bring over my shadow slider way up into here, what it's saying is now this spot on the histogram is where the black point is. That point is black and everything below that is black. So all of these values now have gone to black. And because they're all black, that means there's no more detail there. Now I can bring up the output black slider to make it so that those areas aren't black anymore, but you'll notice they still don't have any detail. So even though they're not black, they've still been clipped. So I'm not getting any detail back with the output sliders there. So once I've clipped my blacks, the blacks are clipped. Now you can see there is lots of nice color and detail in those areas. So I wouldn't necessarily want to do that in this image. Now I'm going to reset this really quick. I think we can already see where the advantages of levels over brightness and contrast come into play. But we've also got these eyedroppers on the side here. Let's take a quick look at what they do. This is a black dropper for setting a black point. This is a white eyedropper for setting a white point. And this is a gray point to set a neutral gray color point. So if I quickly want to set a black point, I could take the black eyedropper and say that, yeah, I want these black dark rocks back here to be pure black. So I can click on that and it will automatically set that. Now, if you'll notice what happened there, not only did it make those rocks the black point, but it also changed the colors because those rocks actually weren't neutral black. They had a slight color cast to them. So now they've been set to pure black, which would be 0 in all 3 RGB color channels. And that has now shifted my colors. Now, if I wanted to shift my colors around a pure black point, then that's a good thing. If I liked the colors that I had, then I may not want to use that. The same thing happens with the white dropper. If I come in here and say, okay, something in here should be my white point. Now it sets that to white, and that tone and any other tones in the image that were that level of brightness or brighter are now white. And it's also done the same as the black slider. It's adjusted the colors around that. So that's pure white, not just white in one of the color channels. And finally, the gray point is for setting a gray point. So if there was a color in here that I knew should be exactly neutral gray, let's say this, I could click on that and then it would neutralize the colors around that being neutral gray. Now this is pretty difficult to use in landscape photography because it's hard to know in nature what's supposed to be exactly neutral 18% gray. But if you're shooting in a studio situation or somewhere where you're using something like a gray card that you know is 18% gray, and you also want the colors to be perfectly balanced towards that neutral white balance, then you could click on the gray card with that dropper and that would adjust your color balance. But I never really use that for landscape or nature photography because the light varies so much, and also it's really hard to know with an image what should be exactly neutral gray. And a lot of my landscape photography is kind of based around what I want to communicate through the image. And a lot of that is working with the color balance to my taste, not to some mathematical formula. Now, in addition to working with brightness and contrast, with levels, you can also work with color balance. And that's something you can't do with the brightness contrast adjustment. So if you come up here, we're now working in the composite RGB. This is just kind of pure luminosity, just brightness of the image. But we can go into each of the red, green, and blue color channels and work with the color balance of those channels individually. So I'm in the red channel, and if I grab the midpoint slider and drag it to the left, what that's doing is it's giving us more red. And if I drag it to the right, it's giving us less red. And the opposite of red on the color wheel is cyan. So less red actually equals more cyan. And the midpoint slider just, again, determines the midpoint between that red cyan balance. And then the white slider brings in reds into the highlights, and the black slider brings in cyans into the shadows. And then you can shift that cyan more towards the whole image or more towards just the shadows, depending on where that midpoint is. So you could do that for red, you could do that for green, magenta, and you can do it for blue, yellow. So you have a lot of control over the color balance or the white balance in your image with levels as well. So when is levels most useful? Well, I find that levels is most useful if I'm working with an image that has low contrast. What that means is I've actually got some areas here on the histogram where I don't go to pure white and pure black, so I can move these black and white sliders around a bit without clipping highlights and shadows. But that's a little different when you're working in an image like, let's go to this one. So if we look at the histogram of this image, we can see that the blacks are almost all the way to the black side. The whites, well, I'm not sure this histogram's showing us fully. So let me go ahead and add the levels adjustment layer here. And yeah, we can see the whites actually do extend right out to the edge there. So if I want to work with the contrast in this image, it's already a more contrasty image, but if I want to work with it more, as I move my whites over, I can bring up the brights in the image, but I immediately start clipping the highlights. I can't move that slider without clipping some highlights. And same with the black slider. I can't move that black slider very far before I start clipping my shadows. So in that way, if you've got an image that already has a lot of contrast in it, you may want to add some contrast to the image, but then you're immediately in danger or in jeopardy of clipping highlights and shadows. So this is where curves comes in. So let's add a curves adjustment layer. So curves looks a little different. You'll notice that instead of just some sliders in the histogram, we still have the histogram here, but we've got a graph, we've got a chart, and we do have a couple of sliders, and we've got this slope or this line cutting across the graph. Now, on first inspection, this looks somewhat intimidating a lot of times because there's a lot of stuff going on there. But can you do everything with curves that you could do with levels? And the answer is yes. Everything that levels can do, curves can do. In fact, let's look at a side-by-side comparison of the two so we can see all the ways that everything that's in levels is also in curves. So to compare how levels and curves are the same, I've set up a levels adjustment on the left, and as we saw, I can set a black point and a white point with those two sliders in levels. And in curves, these two sliders do the same thing, a black point and a white point. And if I adjust the midpoint slider in levels, I can make the image brighter or darker. And if I grab a midpoint on the curve and drag it left or right, I can make the image brighter or darker, again, in the same way. When it comes to the output levels, to create a maximum white and black output, you use those sliders in levels, and for curves, you'd grab the endpoints and slide the black point up and the white point down, again, to get the same adjustment. All right, we'll put those back where they were. It's also the same when it comes to color adjustments. So if I go to the red channel in levels and grab the midpoint, if I go to the left, I get more red. If I go to the right, I get more cyan. And in curves, if I go to the red channel and grab the midpoint and go to the left, I get more red. And go to the right, I get more cyan. And finally, the droppers work the same too. So the black dropper sets the black point. The white dropper in levels sets the white point, and the middle gray dropper sets the gray point. And in curves, same thing. Black dropper sets the black point. White dropper sets the white point. And the gray dropper sets a middle gray point. So, as you can see, all of those things between levels and curves are the same. So if levels and curves are actually just the same thing, then what's the big deal? Why would you use one over the other? Well, they're actually not just the same thing. Everything that's in levels is in curves, but curves is actually so much more. And the key to the difference between levels and curves is that levels is a single axis adjustment. If we look here, all we have is an x-axis, and we have 3 points on the x-axis, and that's all. But curves is a 2-axis adjustment. And if you'll look here on levels, we go from dark to light, and on curves, we go from dark to light across the x-axis, but we also have a y-axis that goes from dark to light. So, for example, in levels, when I grab the midpoint slider, I can drag it left for lighter or right for darker, and that's it. In curves, I can grab the midpoint and drag it left for lighter and right for darker, but I can also drag it up for lighter and down for darker. So I can actually move that point on a 2-axis system, and that gives me a huge amount more control. Another thing that gives me more control is that I'm not limited to a black, a white, and a midpoint. I can place these control points anywhere on the curve and then move them independently of each other. So instead of being limited to just one black slider, one white slider, and a midpoint slider, I have the black and the white slider, but I actually have essentially an infinite number of midpoint sliders, which I can place anywhere along the curve, and they each control different parts of the tones in the image. What does that do for you? Well, it means that I can leave my white point where it is. If I start dragging it over, I'm going to immediately start clipping my highlights. But if I leave the white point over there, anchored to that spot, and I just want to lighten some highlights, but I don't want to clip any whites, I can put a point up here in the highlights and drag it up. But notice my white point didn't move, so I didn't clip any of my highlights. And by the same token, instead of moving the black slider over and clipping my blacks, I can leave the black point anchored where it is so I don't clip any blacks, and put a control point here in the darker midtones and pull that down. So I'm darkening those midtones, but I'm not clipping the deepest blacks. So I'm adding contrast, but I'm protecting or preserving my highlights and my shadows. So this gives me a lot of options for really fine tuning the overall contrast in different parts of my image in ways that I could never do with just the 3 sliders in levels. Another great thing in curves is this tool right here that you don't have in levels. It's called the targeted adjustment tool. And when you select that, now you can come out, and as you move the eyedropper around the image, you'll notice that the point on the graph is changing. And so wherever I'm hovering, that's showing me where that particular tone is on the histogram. So I'm right in the middle of the midtones right now. If I come into here, I go down the shadows, and if I go up into the cloud, I'm up here in the bright highlights. And then if I want to make an adjustment, for example, let's say I want to make these bright highlights a little lighter, I can click right there and just pull up on the image itself, and it sets that control point and modifies the curve for me. And if I come down here into these darker shadows, well, let's see, midtones, somewhere in here, and pull those down, then I'm adjusting that contrast using the image as my guide instead of trying to figure out exactly where I should place those points on the curve. And that gets really helpful with color balancing in curves as well, because if I come into the different color channels, I can now use that targeted adjustment tool to say, okay, I want to actually, let me go to the blue channel and say, I want to make these highlights in the clouds a little more yellow. So I'm going to click up there in those highlights and pull that down, because down will be the opposite of blue, and that's yellow. So if I come down here, I can make my highlights a little more yellow. But then if I come down here into the shadows and say, I want to keep the blue in my shadows, I can click down there in the shadows and pull those up to keep the blues in the shadows. And again, that's control that you don't have in levels. And one final thing that I'll point out about levels versus curves is that in levels, you can only increase contrast. So I can make the brights brighter and the darks darker, but this image already has a ton of contrast, and I don't want to increase contrast. I actually want to decrease contrast, and in levels there's no real way to do that. I can make it brighter all over, or I can make it darker all over, or I could use the whites and blacks and increase contrast, but I can't go the other direction. I can't decrease contrast. And as we already saw, I could bring up the output level, but that's not bringing any shadow detail back. That's just making things that were black less black, but it's not bringing back detail. So that's with levels. But in curves, let's take a look. Because it's 2-axis, I'm not stuck with only making my brights brighter like I am with levels. I can actually make my brights darker. So I could bring my brights down, and I could bring my darks up. So I can actually, instead of increasing contrast, I can decrease contrast with curves. So one more advantage to curves. So if curves can do all of that, well, what are the disadvantages? Well, I guess I could say that curves definitely is a more complex and confusing adjustment to use, so it's a little easier to get confused with that. And also, because there's so many ways to make good adjustments with curves, if you're not quite adept at using it, it's also pretty easy to make bad adjustments with curves. So, brightness, contrast, levels, or curves. Have we decided which one is the best? Well, as with just about everything in photography, I think it depends. Curves clearly gives you the most options and control, but it takes some practice to get good at it. The reality is that you could always use curves and accomplish everything you could do in levels or brightness contrast plus more. So if you could only have one of these adjustments, curves would be the obvious choice. However, if you can accomplish what you're trying to do with levels and it's quicker and easier for you, then there's no reason not to use it. And if all you need is to make a basic brightness and contrast adjustment, then the brightness contrast adjustment is the easiest tool of them all. So I hope that clears up any questions you had about the difference between levels and curves and why you might choose to use one over the other. Remember, you can download this video if you'd like to add it to your collection, particularly as a bonus extension to the Photoshop Essentials course. As always, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're doing well, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.